Everyone.
Good morning.
I am Kim Waddell. I'm one of the co-leads for the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Planning team based here at the University of the Virgin Islands. Basically, we are hosting our colleagues from Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi, and specifically the Harte Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies. And so together, we are hosting this meeting focusing on ecosystem services, and specifically here in St. Thomas. And so we are, again, excited to have you join us. I suspect more folks will be logging on, but it looks like we have about 25 folks online, so we will go ahead and get started. I will provide some opening remarks on behalf of my colleagues, specifically Dr. Greg Guanel, the other co-lead for this project based here at UVI. So let's go to the next slide, please. So first, let me introduce the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. This is a project that's been underway for almost 2 years now, and along with our colleagues at VITEMA, this is an effort that basically helps the territory meet its responsibility for maintaining an updated hazard mitigation plan, and we have to renew that every 5 years. Having a current hazard mitigation plan allows the territory or any other jurisdictions, some are states, some are counties, some are large cities, to be eligible for additional funding on an annual basis. And some of this is historically been known as pre or post mitigation funding. Now is under a new program for building resilience infrastructure in communities, BRIC. And it also, having a current plan in place, allows the territory to access additional funds from other federal agencies. And then finally, one of the more important things is that for these plans to really have an effect, have an impact, we need to generate and create public support for not just the recovery process, which we're in, but also to start building in resilience as well as risk reduction initiatives. And the only way we can do that is through implementation and with the help of the private sector, the government, and the communities that are here in the territory. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've been underway here with our colleagues at VITEMA, creating a framework and approach for this. And so this is a rather busy slide, but on the right, you'll see it in the blue box, basically two major concepts. One is the process of preparing the plan, and then there's the outcomes of the plan. And so, for example, today's activity, this workshop, is part of our stakeholder engagement. And so that's captured there. We're focusing on our natural resources sector. On the right, upper right, is the assessment and analysis process, which is fairly technically based, where we characterize some of the hazards and the risks, the vulnerabilities here in the territory. We do a risk assessment, and then also the ideas or strategies that we develop, are they sustainable? So all of that forms the process, and that feeds into the mitigation strategies and the framework for the plan. And that's where, again, more input from the stakeholders, from different communities, the private sector, et cetera, come into play as we refine the takeaways and the lessons learned from that process. And then ultimately that feeds into a set of strategies that we then will send to the governor as part of the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. And these are the outcomes. So we can't do this by ourselves. Even the more larger, more populated states often turn to other resources, and we've done the same here. So our colleagues at Texas A&M are one example. We have other universities, the Naval Postgraduate School, Rutgers, but we also turn to private sector subject matter experts, sort of like an ESI or Info Planning Group. All of them contribute content, analysis, and so forth that feed into the process. But ultimately, the whole framework and approach really is is guided by our interest in resilience, and that influences our research, our understanding, and it's how we basically look at the whole planning process for the HMRP. Next slide, please. So one of the elements that we have folded into the HMRP is the issue of climate change. And for those of you who have lived here a long time, I think climate change is very real. It isn't something on the horizon. It's not something imagined. We live in a very challenging part of the world in the sense of hazards. We are on we're in a place that is exposed to earthquakes, potentially tsunamis. We often get landslides because of our topography, but we also obviously have experienced stronger and more intense storms. The hurricanes of 2017 are the most recent example. But even the drought that we hopefully are ending, or at least getting a respite from the last few months, we've had a very severe drought that's affected our farmers, gardeners, but just even the hillsides have browned up. But in the last few weeks, we've gotten a little bit of rain and things are greening up. But nonetheless, we are exposed to these longer and longer droughts over time. And then meanwhile, the oceans, the temperatures are rising in the sea level is going up, and we're also experiencing warmer temperatures on land. And all of these have cascading effects on the services, the systems, the communities here in the territory. Next slide. So this is really captures our approach for what we're doing with our hazard mitigation and resilience planning. We're looking at the hazards, the sectors, and doing a system analysis with, again, this focus on resilience. So at the top there, you will see the 4 hazards that was in the previous slide. And we're looking at 2 major areas of impact or consequence. First are the critical infrastructure, you know, the government, its ability to do its job, but also the energy sector, transportation, telecommunications, but also our natural ecosystems, the coastal waters, our coral reefs, our forests, our guts, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, we think about all of these critical infrastructure providing essential services to the territory. And so this manifests itself through our economy, through our housing, education, health, et cetera. And we look at all those, the impact of those hazards on those different sectors, and using that lens of resilience, take it through the hazard mitigation planning process, and ultimately the recommendations and strategies that we develop, and most importantly, implement in the future, will lead to a more resilient Virgin Islands. Next slide. So what we've done so far, and we'll touch upon some of that today, you'll see in some of the slides, but we've been actively involved in this planning and implementation development process. We've been involved in doing a lot of interviews, field work, data collection, data analysis, et cetera. We're also looking at the root causes of some of the challenges that we've identified here in the territory. Again, using opportunities like workshops and what have you, we do community outreach. And then we augment that with knowledge sharing, like I said, webinars, workshops, but also op-ed pieces in both social media and print media. But the sort of the heart of this effort is on the right side, where we look at the technical research and the impacts of these hazards. And with, you know, again, I'm repeating some of this, but we're looking at climate change, the hazards, and then again, how do those affect the essential services, our infrastructure, et cetera. But the last 3, the built environment, the natural environment, and our communities, the social and cultural environment, those are the fundamental foundations of resilience here in the territory. So it's those 3 that we really want to look at. Next slide, please. So thinking about our natural resources, we are looking at some of the non-structural issues that affect or negatively impact the resilience of our natural resources and systems here in the territory. And so the topics that are in italics with a check mark are things that we know are happening here or underway in various levels. So for example, we have these underlying risk drivers, these things that make the disasters or the risks they're in more dangerous, more challenging. And so one of them is that the fact is that we do not have a comprehensive land and water use plan here in the territory. And so that has led to some unplanned and rapid urbanization, and it's created larger areas of risk. For example, low-lying areas along the coast where we have a lot of our population is at greater risk due to flooding because of what we've done up on the hillsides. But we also have, as people well know, we have poverty and inequality here in the territory. And again, this climate change is a persistent, chronic, a stressor that exacerbates all of these challenges. We also have these compounding factors, sort of demographic change. Our populations sometimes go up, sometimes they go down, especially after disasters. We also have unsustainable uses of our natural resources. You know, some parts of our coastal waters are overfished, our hillsides and watersheds aren't protected as well as they should, and consequently we have declining ecosystems. But there are a lot of other factors, and they're listed here. You know, we have inconsistent enforcement of environmental regulations. We have policies that are developed without thinking about disaster or the risk that they pose. And then, of course, most recently, the pandemics, how that impacts our economy, which in turn, when our economy is impacted, you know, this puts greater strain on all of the infrastructure and our communities across the board. All right, next slide. So ultimately, what we hope this plan will do is, through the recommendations and the strategies and ultimately the implementation, we hope to increase the robustness of the systems that provide these services, whether they're in the natural or in the built environment. We also want to highlight or emphasize the importance of operation and maintenance. I mean, these systems have to be maintained. We've spent an enormous amount of money preparing and building new things or fixing old things. But the fact is, one of the key criteria, especially in the future, will be our ability to maintain this infrastructure and those services. We also, in order to do that, though, we have to think about building capacity in the territory. And this is a role and opportunity for the university to provide training and expand our collaborations with the private sector, with the government, to cultivate the workforce that is needed to maintain that infrastructure, to provide those services, and to make these systems more robust. But ultimately, none of this really works without us increasing community cohesion. And that's, you know, when we have a shared interest in our natural resources or in our built environment or in our education system, all of these things, when we share those values and work together, that's ultimately going to be the biggest driver of resilience here in the territory. All right, next slide, please. So drilling down a little bit, what we've asked our colleagues at Texas A&M as part of their work for the Hazard Mitigation Resilience Plan, and I apologize for the wordiness of this slide, but this really captures the scope of work, the tasks that we've given them, and they will touch upon a number of these today. So, for example, they will help us qualify and quantify the benefits we get from our natural environment, and especially how it pertains or mitigates some of the natural hazards that we face here in the territory. They're also going to touch upon, you know, our land use patterns and practices, and then how does that impact the ecosystem service benefits. And they'll provide a couple of case studies today and through the rest of the week with the other islands, looking at targeted efforts and ideas to propose for your consideration, and that'll be part of the discussion later today. They won't be doing much of a trade-off analysis, but I think we'll plant the seeds for that in a way that allows us to think about the trade-offs. When we decide to do one thing, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and are we making, quote unquote, the right decision or the best decision? And then finally, what we hope to get from you in this discussion session later in the meeting is to start developing recommendations and your ideas for ways the territory can strengthen the underlying positive factors and enhance the resilience of the territory. So I think I have one more slide, but I wanted to give my colleague, Dr. Greg Bunnell, a chance to weigh in if there was anything I skipped over or could have elaborated on before I move on? Okay. It may not be on. Let's see.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Everyone, I was just with, I'm sharing a desk and a screen with our colleague Dijani. So yeah, no, I don't have much to add. Just thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm really excited about this conversation, the role that natural system and ecosystem services play in the overall framework that we're developing is critical. I think that, as Kim mentioned in his slide, it often does not receive the attention that it deserves. Often it is mostly through a very specific project in terms of, oh, we're going to restore a coral reef here, or we're going to restore mangrove here, without fully taking the time to create a more comprehensive picture of what those services provide, or what those services are, in the larger scheme of increasing resilience of the territory. So this effort is very, I think, exciting for this overall project, but also for the USVI, and really appreciate everybody's presence today at the workshop, and really looking forward to hearing more of Dr. Ragster, former president of the UVI, thoughts on this and insights. Thank you.
All right, let me go to the final slide here from my. So hopefully you realize I've just done the welcoming introduction with my colleague, Dr. Waddell. And so before I introduce Dr. Ragster, she's going to be our next speaker and provide the keynote address. Then we're going to hear from our colleagues from both Texas A&M Harte Institute and their collaborators here at UVI. They will actually spend time looking at these ecosystem services and the relationship to hazard mitigation in the Virgin Islands. We'll have a break around 10:30 or so, and then they'll come back where we actually do that, as I mentioned earlier, looking at two specific St. Thomian sites that look at these trade-offs, and they'll walk us through a model and an exercise in that. And then we'll conclude where, and I really hope everyone will stay on board with us towards the end, because this is where we will hear from folks from the community, but also engage in this group discussion, hopefully to generate or stimulate some ideas around recommendations or issues that we should be aware of or take into consideration as we develop the plan. So that's our agenda today. And so before I turn it over to our keynote speaker, it's my profound privilege and honor to introduce Dr. Laverne Ragster, who, if those of you who have been here in St. Thomas for the last few decades, you're well aware of her contribution and leadership here at the university. I think the strength and impact of her career at the university really stems from, in part, that she's worked her way up through the ranks, so to speak. I mean, she's been a professor in marine biology, then she was dean, she was then the provost, and she was the vice president. And, you know, I think that insight and, you know, I've been in your shoes type of experience really prepared her for the leadership role as the president. She ran the university from 2002 to 2009. And I was fortunate enough to have been working here at the time, and she's been an inspiration and a mentor this whole time for me. Currently, she's on assignment with the UVI's Caribbean Exploratory Research Center, CERC, where she's focusing on climate change adaptation here in the Caribbean, but especially with a focus on public health. As I mentioned, the rising temperatures on land is creating all sorts of health hazards and so forth. So she's playing a strong leadership role in that as well. She's also on an innumerable number of regional boards and organizations providing leadership and guidance. But again, I think of her as a native St. Thomian that has done well for the island. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Laverne Ragster. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Waddell, and good morning to everyone. One of the things that hardly ever comes up in my bio is the fact that if you try to do natural resource management in the Caribbean over any period of time, you're likely to have a number of amazing experiences. One I often don't share with people is having to run a session on trying to train faculty from the universities across the Caribbean, so Dutch, English, Spanish, French, um, to learn how to deal with resource management as part of what they teach their students, what the kind of research that they do, and having people call me a heretic. And because I said, you need to talk about the role of how the people and the resource come together. So for chemists and some biologists and others, this was not to be had. We have come a long ways from then. And so I'm hoping today this conversation will be a lot nicer than that. So thank you, Mr. Emmanuel. We're going to try to talk today about the critical role of natural resources in USVI development, specifically focusing on St. Thomas. And I appreciate the opportunity to do that because the three islands really had different kinds of experiences with this. And I will tell you, next slide, please. We're going to really speak to this less from the point of the resources and more from the point of the people. So to remind you, the annoying thing we have to do when we go look for us in the world is that you have to find a dot on the map and find another one that says that there's a group of islands there. And St. Thomas is the one that I get the chance this time to do what many countries do, which is you make your place bigger than everything else and way out of scale. So that's what that map is in the middle. It's only 13 miles long and 3 miles wide. And some of the 3 miles wide is due to us filling in the harbor numerous times over the last couple of centuries. Next. So while I tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today, I wanted to just let you know that the context for this thing has to do with understanding parts about what's happening on the island with respect to the people as well as the natural resources. So the one city on St. Thomas, as everybody on this call knows, is Charlotte Amalie, and that's, or Charlotte Amalie for some people. That's basically the name of a Danish queen at the time. And that was done, what I didn't know before was that we used to be called the Bear Hall. So Charlotte Amalie is better. We might change it to something else. And our population has fluctuated over time, but it basically has grown from like 100 people to 112,000 people at a peak around 2008 and started to come down. St. Thomas in 1980 had about 44,000 people and went up to over the last, between now that time and 2010 or so, we went up to almost 50, a little bit over 50,000. So we may be talking about carrying capacities here in terms of numbers of people. Now, one of the things I want to do when we look at island characteristics is to talk about the business of people like to speak about, all of us do it, about the community of the US Virgin Islands. The community of the US Virgin Islands is made up of many communities. We are a people of the world. We always have been. If you look at the over 300-year history of this place being here, in terms of population by Europeans and Africans, it's always been open, except for a few times. So there have been people from all over the world. So it's almost always multi-ethnic, multiracial, and that has continued with time. So it's not surprising to find in our stats that we are people born in the Virgin Islands or from the Eastern Caribbean, Dominican Republic, Haiti. You also have to add Jamaica, Trinidad. There are almost no islands from the region missing. Then you talk about mainland US, South America, Europe, Africa, New Zealand, China, India, Middle East, and so forth. We don't have penguins from Antarctica, but that's probably about it. So everybody is here. So community cannot be one perspective, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. As we move forward, I would remind you that we have limited space because it's only 13 miles long. So housing and what you do is going to become important. So you'll find out as we go forward that one of the reasons probably that we import most of our food is that even though agriculture started here early in 1672, by the 1700s, St. Thomas had given up almost all his plantations. And people were in town trying to make money through commodities and commerce and trading. We have gone through periods of severe poverty, actually big, long periods of it. And but we still have poverty here, but it is not as bad as it has been in the past. So the points I want you to remember as we go forward have to do with multi-ethnic poverty. Also, the fact that this is an open border space. We are open to 300 plus million people coming here at any time they want to, and we have no control over that, okay? So as an unincorporated territory, this is part of what we have to deal with. Now, one of the things that none of our projects, when we talk about resilience, try to handle is the business of uncertainty actually in the collective minds of the community. The history of this place has been, it's burnt down multiple times over the last 2 centuries. There have been major hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis. In 1867 was the worst one. And droughts in between. Flooding is not as bad, partially because of our steep slopes, and always issues with housing. Those are part of the things that in the minds of people that you now say, form a resilience plan. I might ask, you're asking me to be resilient to get to the next crisis, which I know I will eventually overcome and then move on to what? So how we define resilience may need to be looked at. Okay, next, well, before you go, Ms. Emmanuel, I want to tell you real quickly that we're going to look at the context a little bit, including the major ecosystems and the services they provide, which Dr. Waddell has done some of that already. And then we're going to talk about the kinds of development efforts we've had here over the last centuries or so, and then look at some of the factors that support ecosystem resilience in the territory. Next slide. So reminder, small size. This is not something the US Virgin Islands made up. Almost all islands in the world have to deal with this. So everybody knows you have limited control of impacts from external economic changes. You're vulnerable to shipping and transportation shifts. My favorite one is my mother telling me there was a time when there was no toilet paper on the island. Vulnerable to natural hazards. We are limited in natural, human, and institutional resources. When we plan, we have to think about how to adjust around these things. Any system that we move to our space has to be customized to address this. Next. Mr. Emmanuel, next slide, please. Thank you. So just a reminder, you'll get more of this from our friends in Texas, and Dr. Waddell has already started. On the marine side, the healthy coastlines, and that's important in terms of scrub and berms and so forth, as well as the marine ecosystems that we have, the major ones, are ones that support our fisheries. They support land protection, tourism, recreation, and the part that we keep forgetting when we do resilience is to focus on the quality of life component that comes in. It is important to many, many people here, money or not, that they live in a beautiful place. And that is something that we need to keep in mind, because you can develop activities that bring you money, but they may not be in a place that you want to live. So one of the things that we find is that the hazards that come through our area impact all of these resources, but they have helped us. We have evidence that we have less flooding from storm surge because of reefs off of the coast of islands, specifically St. Croix Harbor, but other places have also have benefited from that. Mangroves have helped with reducing wind coming in, those kinds of things. So, and of course, they've supported our tourism areas, and we'll speak about that. Next. On the land side, I had to cheat here, and the gut you see on the left is actually the Bethlehem gut in St. Croix. We don't have a gut that runs like that all the time, but that sits with water. That's very unusual. Maybe the young gut at some points, but most of these gullies were ephemeral and based on the kinds of things we've done especially in the Charlotte Amalie area with development, they don't run very often. The ones on the north side do when there's a lot of rain. The middle is a shot of Megan's Bay at a time when it was happier before the 2017 storms. And you can see the coastal scrub there and that it has a role. It's not to be clear. If you clear it out, it makes a difference with what happens to the inland area. And then the last one is a pond that is very typical of St. Thomas because we have gotten rid of almost all of the coastal ponds and put in hotels or other things into those areas. But there are some left and some that the farmers have dug. But what they do is control runoff, help us with erosion, and they have served as a water source at different times. Next slide. So through this we've been here a little while as a community from 1600s as far as the inhabitants are concerned. Our set of inhabitants, there were folks here before us for sure from the 50 or before even 1500s. And I'm talking about St. Thomas now. So St. Thomas started having plantations in 1672. By 1700s, they're gone for the most part. The ones that would continue on St. Croix. So that's what the 1970 number is in terms of actually getting resources from revenues from agriculture. What has been part of our experience is smaller farms for either subsistence or a local market, or times when things were really good, we were trading with the BVI or other places. That has continued. And probably it's an area that we have not benefited enough from for a number of reasons. But to do that, you need land with usable soil. You're talking about we're living on what's left of a over 1 million year old volcanic area with very little topsoil that's not very usable sometimes for growing things. And you need adequate fresh water. You don't have big sources of fresh water except for rain, and so storage and desalinization, if you can afford it, becomes really important. But the natural part are the water and the soil. I'm taking sun for granted. Fisheries also started with the folks that came in the 1600s in terms of our review of things. And it was artisanal and commercial along the way. And the artisanal part on our side is now being impacted by one of the resource use issues we have to deal with, which is overstressing the stocks. But pot fishing, using seines, long lines, all of those are part of our history and use for revenue and subsistence. Diving and trawls more in the last century, and we are one of the few places in the Caribbean that actually collects data on recreational fisheries, but it happens in other places. But St. Thomas had a higher proportion of that going on than it does now. Hurricanes have not helped. What the resources are that drive this include nursery habitats, really important. Fish don't pop out of the air, they have to come from somewhere. And so our mangroves and so forth are important. Unpolluted oceans. This takes us back to the people, the pollution comes from us. So healthy marine ecosystems in general. A number of our reefs inshore are gone for sedimentation and other reasons. So the linkages are clearly there. And so the dollar signs that you're going to get from our colleagues, Dr. Waddell, will be very useful for people to see what's worth investing in some ways. And the last major one for St. Thomas is tourism. So 1840, I put 1840 because that's when the Grand Hotel in downtown Charlotte Amalie was put up. And that started the different forms of tourism over the centuries moving forward. Clearly in the 70s, things started to really pick up. And that was based on the fact that we began to figure out it would happen. And so there was an influx of people from the Eastern Caribbean and other parts of the region to help build the territory, along with the fact that there was a need for workers on St. Croix for the industries that were coming up. Now, this history that I have here is overlaid with a number of other things happening in the community, including the ability to be able to actually have successful times from the 1600s, but dependent on making sure that somebody took care of the harbor issues. So when they opened the harbor in 1862, disconnecting Hassel Island from St. Thomas, it helped to reduce some of the health problems and allowed more people to come here, because our reputation as a place that killed because of disease was very bad at times. But we didn't clean up the harbor by stopping sewage going into it until 1971. That is a long timeline. So we need to look at how long it takes us to improve some things. Every part of downtown that you think you drive over as part of the island, probably the field at Crown Bay, at Havenside, where around the legislature, the waterfront, they're all from dredge in the harbor at different times during the history of our community. And that means that the tourism that we have now, allowing large boats to come in, the fisheries that we have, allowing having a place where we have a better flow in the area, because what happened in the harbor impacted other places, is due to a natural resource that we take for granted. So if you're going to have tourism, you need land and space to do things. So housing for commercial use becomes important. You need adequate fresh water, an unpolluted ocean, and healthy marine ecosystems. The economic evaluation or valuation of that those linkages have been done for other places, but I'm not aware of it being done here. Next slide, almost done. So the last thing I wanted to do was to ask your brain to play with the question of and. How do you deal with ands? Many problems in the territory are not either or questions. It has to do with, I want to do this, so how can I get two things to happen to make this happen? In this case, I'm saying that we're asking for resources, for natural resources that are healthy and available over a long term for rational use, for development, for living, okay? On the challenge side, I put some of the things that you spoke about, Dr. Waddell. Clearly, climate change impacts are there. And we don't have a lot of control over those. We have to do adaptation stuff. But along with that are some of the things you spoke about: inappropriate to harmful land tenure and use practices, land-based pollution of the ground and ocean, coastal erosion based on again, where we put things, like new highways and so forth. High extraction, I couldn't resist. High extraction pressure on marine stocks. That's been going on for a long time. I remember when scuba diving opened up our conch populations to a level of pressure it could not withstand. There were conch much closer in and many more, and we've lost most of it. Inadequate waste management linked to how we handle goods and coming into the territory, the amount coming in and what we do with it when it gets here. Inadequate, inappropriate involvement of stakeholders in resource management. That is a challenge. We think, I believe, that my colleagues that are scientists and folks that work in the government believe that we find the standards, we find the data, and we can fix it. And I propose that that will not happen in any sustainable way if we do not get people more involved in how we deal with resource management. So on the other side, on the resilience support side, I put technical assistance like we're getting from Texas A&M, that we get from the federal government and other people, with examples from others that we can customize or see as a way to think about things. The natural resource management goal setting in the local context with standards and data are a way to support us getting to resilient ecosystem services. But how we set the goals is the question that you spoke about, Dr. Waddell, and I think that's one of the things that we need to grapple with. To use community-based research and stakeholder involvement and practice it. So one of the reasons I like working with CERC is that every project that we have done for the last 6 years has involved up to 6 different agencies, community service organizations, people that are involved with whatever the issue is, to determine what it is you're going to do about a particular issue. It is hard work. Everybody is overworked. There's never enough time, and it takes time. So, but I think that is the way to getting answers that will work over the long term. And also to acknowledge the linkages to quality of life. If we don't do that, people will continue to make decisions based only on how much revenue we should be getting. So the idea is, how can we balance this back and forth? Because both sides are going to continue for a long time. That to me is the challenge for the territory. Next slide. So I end by saying St. Thomas, as a small island in the Caribbean, has experienced an amazing and sometimes painful development journey. And the journey has included and been supported by the natural resources of the 13 by 3 miles island. We've gotten help from lots of people, but we definitely get support from our own natural resources. So I think people can see that 2021 is a part of another set of changes and development challenges for the island and the communities of the territory. And once again, how natural resources are used and conserved will be critical to a positive and maybe sustainable future. In the past, it has been crash and burn. We don't need to do that if we don't have to. Resolving this development challenge, I think, is a worthy undertaking, but I do not think it's likely to succeed or be successful without a more effective and inclusive approach to goal setting and implementation. And that means whatever that structure is, that vehicle, we need to figure out, and it has to involve our decision makers, figure out how we're going to do it. Everybody doesn't have to be in downtown St. Thomas talking about it at the same time, but it really needs to be a better everybody. Last slide. So I want to say thank you. And I know I went over a few minutes, my apologies, but I hope that gave you some information to think about. It's not new, but it's something I think we need to think about.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Ragster. You continue to exceed I'm always impressed with your comments and insights. And I mean, that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have you speak today. I'd like to open it up. We have about 15 minutes, a little less, for questions, follow-ups. So I'll open it up. I have a couple myself, but I want to make sure the audience has a chance to weigh in first. So I think the simplest thing, if you know how to raise your hand on your, raise your hand, or put a comment in the chat box, and we'll try and catch it there. I think we have people watching the chat for people wanting to raise questions. Don't be shy.
Somebody asked why the inhabitants before 1672 not included in the conversation. Mostly because I was they should have been, and I apologize. Miguel, Mr. Quinones, yes, it is, they are a part of our history, no question. I didn't have enough time to pull all of this into one. I'm struggling now with how much I left out as it is, but you are absolutely correct. Life did not start in the Virgin Islands in 1672.
So, Dr. Ragster, you mentioned early on, and as an ecologist, I really am sensitized to this term carrying capacity. And I was wondering if you know, when you think about our resources, past and present, I mean, obviously the landscape has changed and we may not ever return to the bounty that we saw even 40 or 50 years ago. But in light of what you've seen over the last 30, 40 years, I mean, is there a number, or is it better to think about an approach to managing the resources and the expectations of the population to strike that balance?
Well, I think if you used quality of life as a goal, you would get to a place where you would say, well, you'd say this is enough more often. You have a place against which to make that decision. What a number of our decisions in the last few decades have been driven by growth and trying to make more revenue for the territory. And that has happened many times in our past. It's not something new. But I think when people push back, they push back because all of a sudden things that they were able to see or do in the environment are lost to whatever the activities are. So that is being answered on a quality of life issue more than anything else. And that has very little to do with how much money the person makes. Because you will find people in this territory, even the folks that have the least, it is important that they can go someplace and get in the ocean.
Okay. I see we have a question from Miguel.
Yes. I asked the previous question about the donut economics because that quality of life and that balance that you talk about between the ecological systems and the social systems has been explored through the approach of donut economics by Kate Raworth. What it is, in this imaginary donut, you have a boundary which supports the ecological systems. And if we use too many of the environments, then we're off balance environmentally. And then on the other side, if we have too many poor people or not enough transportation, then that affects the social balance. So when all the systems are within the carrying capacity or whatnot, and then we live within the donut. So I think it's a framework that has been used in different places, and we have sister islands like Curacao and Barbados that are embracing that approach because it's a more systemic and holistic approach to urbanization.
No, I agree with you. It makes a lot of sense. Remember I said in the beginning, you needed to think about some of the context, and I completely agree with you. One of the reasons that places like Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad have more of an opportunity to do that is because of their sovereign control. Regardless of whether or not they pass they pass the test, but they have more of an opportunity to do that than we do. But that doesn't mean we don't have one. I think that the challenge for us comes from the mindset that we don't have one. Okay, if we feel as a people, as a community, as a political system, that there's very little that we can do besides agree that Americans think it's okay to make money, then we're going to have the kind of issues that we're having now and worse. Because our space does not match what happens on a continent, okay? And a lot of the other conditions don't match either, but it does not mean it's a bad goal to want to have good revenues coming in, or to have people educated, or to use your land in ways that can help people to generate money, and at the same time not disturb the flora and fauna in ways where we lose the little that we have. Those things are possible, but the mindset has to be a truly independent thinking one, living within a non-independent space. I had a friend who was a president who told me he had learned how to lead from his knees, but he could also fight better than anybody from those knees. because everybody thinks the president could do everything, but there are people that tell you what to do. And if you don't kneel down, they will knock you down. So he doesn't want to get knocked down. But he got what he wanted to get because he learned how to do that. I do not think the Virgin Islands has learned how to do that yet.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a question, I believe. I'll start with Kimiko Link. You could, I know you put it in the chat room, but maybe you could articulate it for those that aren't following the chat.
Oh yeah, thank you for this great presentation and for the whole series. It's remarkable. But I was wondering, in terms of the VI government, UVI, all the different stakeholders that are involved in this this conversation, thought process, decision making. I was wondering how the VI addresses these multiple elements and impacts, concerns from in coordination, organization, communication, and prioritization perspective.
Well, I thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I think our response to it is pretty poor. One of the challenges that we've had is that to look like a place that's a worthy place in the world, we have replicated a system in terms of governance, in terms of approaches to things. We get a lot of money from the federal government. The standards come from there for the most part. And sometimes we're able to change things a little, but basically we go along with that. So if you are busy dealing with that kind of system and you don't move away from silo approaches or from addressing things only that appear to be asked from the outside, the coordination that you're speaking about is difficult to get. The partnerships and collaboration across the government and the private sector and the communities has to be built in from our side, and we don't often do that. I see another question from, you're most welcome. I hope that helped. I see a question from Jason Butson. Good morning, Jason. Land use plan. I remember the days, we almost got to the point of having to go and picket about this. Long time, it's been going on for a long time. A land and water use plan is another way of saying, can we figure out what our goals are and come to a comprehensive or coherent idea about the direction for the territory. And the last time it got disabled by a number of things, including special interest areas. So I think it is something that would be helpful to the territory as long as we do the planning to move forward in a way that doesn't allow that to happen again.
All right. We have a question from Janet Krieger. She's asking, how do we balance this sort of the new development, especially with all of the recovery funding that's come in? How do we balance that with the quality of life issue? I mean, I think Dr. Ragster, you mentioned that if we're just chasing dollar, then that's going to be driving the decision and the rationale. And,
Right.
If we want to shift away from that to look at quality of life, however it's measured or however it's characterized, I mean, what's the process to help us do that? I mean, we have this new waterfront highway, along in Charlotte, Amalia. And I mean, what do you think? What do you suggest?
Well, the new waterfront, the highway will be a positive part of quality of life for some people in terms of it will help with some aspects of the transportation issue. It will not solve the problem completely. It was meant to solve, I don't think. But we've lost some more of the harbor, okay? And the question is, will there be repercussions to that with respect to storm surge and sea level rise issues? So because that's the other side of the coin. Remember I said that the business of not feeling you have control, we started the process of trying to change the waterfront decades ago. This is an old project. And it's like, okay, so I want to buy this car and I put down $100 And then I keep piling up the money over years until I finally get to the place where I can buy the car. But by the time I get ready to buy the car is not the car that I need. Okay, and we didn't change it enough. We didn't change it enough. Again, that's our side not being able to stand up and say, listen, we have these data, this kind of information, this goal with respect to quality of life, and we would like to look at this differently. I think when we stand up that way, the federal government for the first couple of times is going to react, not necessarily, depends on who we run into, the way we would like all the time. But if we go with the right kind of information and do what we get things together on our side, I believe that we will prevail. It is still a challenge for the territory to function in the large system that it exists. Remember, we're in the Department of Interior. This is the place that the United States puts externals, okay? And it has not in the past had a really good track record with that. It has not been bad with us. It was better than the Navy. But the question is, can we step up to using the opportunity of being able to get funding and support and guidance from such an area?
All right, point well taken, thank you. Think that is, we're actually coming up, we're a minute, we have one more minute, and I don't know if there's any other questions. I'm scrolling through, see if I see any raised hands. I don't see any. So let me just take this opportunity again to thank Dr. Ragster for her presentation. I think it really sort of set the tone for some of the questions that we are tackling later in the workshop. But more importantly, as a thought leader here in the territory, I really appreciate your insights, touching upon the history, but also what are the challenges today, and what, how do we strike that balance? Because I think ultimately all of us believe that quality of life is what makes this place special, and yet it seems like it's at most risk sometimes, and this is the time to make a decision. So again, on behalf of everyone in the audience, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you can stay with us for some of the other presentations.
I will.
Good, good. All right, so moving on, right on time. Our next set of presentations is primarily going to be led by our colleagues from Texas A&M's Corpus Christi campus, specifically the Harte Research Institute for the Gulf of Mexico Studies, which is arguably the longest title of an institute I've ever heard, but I will refer to them as the Harte Institute moving forward. But we also have colleagues from the University of the Virgin Islands speaking. But the presentation I think we'll start with is by the Harte Institute Executive Director, Dr. David Yaskowitz, who I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 15 years or so. And then he has team members, Christine Hale, Kara Coffey, Dijani Laplace, and from UVI we'll hear from Christopher McDonald. But I'll turn it over to Dr. Yaskowitz. And we're setting up the slides with the slide.
Good morning, I'm David Yaskowitz. I'm the Senior Executive Director of the Harte Research Institute and Endowed Chair for Socioeconomics at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. Looking forward this morning to talking to you about planning for a resilient USVI and the role that ecosystem services can play. So one thing that we do know is that change is constant, and especially around climate change. Many of us in our own lifetimes have seen significant change with the results of changing water cycles, intensity of storms, etc. This animation over the last 100 years or so shows the change in average temperature during that time period. As is demonstrated here, the warmer the bars, the greater amount over the average temperatures. And so you can see in that last 100 years that we are having higher temperature averages than earlier on. And this is no surprise to any of us. But the results of that increase in temperature and the frequency of that increase in temperature is creating this new normal. So in the extreme heat events are more frequent, and we all have experienced this. That has the tendency to drive other hazards. So a warming climate happens to increase in some areas, rainfall, given change in weather patterns. And so what we've seen over the last 50 years or so, as demonstrated by this meteorological data from a number of different sources, as increasing temperature has seen an increase in the rise of the number of floods. Now, I must caution here that this isn't accounting also for the number or the increase in population that has found itself in more flood-prone areas. But we also see an increase of extreme weather beyond just flooding. Okay? More intensive storms, obviously more intensive flooding, and more significant droughts. That the average that we all used to talk about is really now just the point between two extremes, where we go from extreme drought to extreme wet or flood conditions. And those have really significant impacts, in that the increase in population, along with the increase in hazards, whether it be flood, storm, wind damage, drought, tornadoes, etc., now we are putting more humans in harm's way. And so you can see since 1980 here on this bar graph that we find ourselves in increasing economic risk because of the way we build and where we build with increasing populations. And so on this graphic, and provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, these billion-dollar disasters have increased in frequency as time has gone on. And in 2020, around the world, this has had significant impact on individuals and communities and cities in terms of displacing individuals as a result of natural disasters. And in 2020, it was estimated that over 30 million people were displaced because of natural disasters, 14 million of that from flooding and 32,000 from drought. In the United States alone, including the US Virgin Islands, 1.7 million individuals were displaced because of natural disasters. So what can we take away from this and be thinking about our connection to the natural environment, to natural habitats, and how they might be able to mitigate and create resilience? So hazard mitigation, in the definition that we want to use here, is the process of taking measures to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Whereas resilience is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. So how can we begin to mitigate impacts from flooding, extreme storm events, drought, etc.? Well, one of the things we can begin to think about is how we connect the natural environment to the human environment and the role that the natural environment plays for mitigation and resilience. So ecosystem services have been defined in many ways, but it most basically is that direct and indirect contributions from the natural environment or from ecosystems that help support, sustain, and enrich human life. And typically we have had divided up ecosystem services in 4 really major categories. So the cultural services, what we call provisioning services, such as food, fiber, the regulating services, and these are the services that are provided that help regulate Earth system processes that are really important to you and I as human beings. A big thing might be such as carbon sequestration or the lack of it, unfortunately. Also nutrient cycling, etc. And then support services that are things such as pollination. That's extremely important in, for example, crop production. So those are those direct and indirect values that we get from the natural environment. And then we have a whole other category that don't want to spend a lot of time on, but a little bit more technical in terms of how we think about this as economists, are these non-use or passive use values. And so things that, such as the existence of the ecosystem in a pristine state is really important. And we want that to be around to be able to have our children and grandchildren enjoy that. So that's a bequest value that we get from a pristine natural environment. So really, if you think about it, ecosystem services can happen really anywhere that there's this interaction and this benefit that between the natural environment and human well-beings. And so ecosystem services are really demand driven. And what I mean by that is that you could have always the potential supply from the natural environment to provide these benefits, but they have to be demanded for the actual service to take place or to occur. And as I said, they can occur on the landward side or the seaward side and in the margins in between. As I mentioned earlier, some examples of ecosystem services are nutrient processing for supportive service, primary reduction, hydrological cycle, regulating services, a lot of the processes that can control ecosystems, provisioning services, raw material, and the cultural services, which a lot of us are very familiar with, but are very difficult to maybe value, are things such as recreation, aesthetics, science and education, and cultural, spiritual, and historic significance. But demonstrating the value can be challenging. It can be done in monetary terms, right? Dollar, pounds, gold, bullion, whatever makes sense. But we can also value the benefits from our natural environment in non-monetary terms, such as just easy ranking. Does it make us feel good? Does it make us feel bad? Whatever it may be. So I think the point here is that value can be demonstrated in many different ways, and the way that you demonstrate that value should be the most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. Right? So if we look at the U.S. Virgin Islands from the ridge to the reef, and this is something that I've worked on in trying to, how do we connect that natural environment to those constituents of well-being that emanate from ecosystem services? And so we take the habitats themselves. So in the U.S. Virgin Islands, let's think about this in terms of a ridge to reef and all the habitats that are in between there. And so those habitats have this biophysical functioning, right? What they do, whether it be, the forests, the mangroves, the reefs, et cetera, they function in a certain way. But as part of a bigger system, there's this ecological functioning that takes place with the other habitats or species around it, such as creating a spawning nursery, nutrient cycling, that interaction between abiotic and biotic, gas exchange, et cetera. And it's that ecological function that then leads into the many different ecosystem services that we talked about before. And it's the experience of those benefits or those ecosystem services that then creates this well-being in us as individuals or communities. And so it's a well-functioning ecosystem that provides these benefits that leads to things such as this personal security, material being that, livelihoods and food and shelter, the health aspects, the social relations, etc. So the benefits from the natural environment, which we call ecosystem services, are those things that affect our well-being eventually. And so in the Virgin Islands, as well as elsewhere around the world, we've seen some significant changes since, in just the last couple of decades, right? Big part of this is land use changes. And those changes have then affected the habitats, which then have affected the provision of ecosystem services that could potentially, in what we're talking about today, have mitigating factors against the hazards that are a result of climate change, and therefore can lead potentially to less resilience. And so being able to demonstrate and talk about the benefits connected to the natural environment, the services that we get from that, within this frame of hazard mitigation and resilience is critical in helping us to make decisions about what we need to protect, restore, conserve for hazard mitigation and resilience. And then in the world that we live in, which is of scarce resources, right? We have to be able to make some decisions about trade-offs. And so being able to identify those benefits or services that are most important for certain types of mitigation, ecosystem services helps us in that. And we'll be talking a lot about that today.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Yaskowitz. Do you want to introduce the next speakers from your team, or are they going to self-introduce? I wasn't sure.
I think they're going to self-introduce.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll hold off on questions until we get to the end of this session, if that's okay. All right. Let's move on then.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dijani Laplace. I'm a research assistant at the Harte Research Institute at Texas A&M Corpus Christi. And today I'll be giving a brief overview of the habitats on St. Thomas and some of the ecosystem services that they provide. But first, let's look at these land use maps. So here on the left, we have a land use map of St. Thomas in 1985. And on the right, we have a land use map of St. Thomas in 2018. So immediately right off the bat, you can tell that St. Thomas has undergone some major development over the last 35 years or so. So we already know that the Charlotte and Raleigh area was already pretty developed, development being here, the low intensity development being pink, red being the medium intensity, and high intensity development being dark red. You can see that Charlotte and Raleigh area already had some low-level intensity development in 1985. So it's no surprise that it saw high intensity development now in 2018. But one area that saw massive upticks in development that wasn't there previously was the Estate Tutu area, seen here. So you can tell that there were a lot of shrubs and some low intensity development here in the area, and now there's a lot of medium to high intensity development in the Estate Tutu area. Now let's look at these land use maps again, but as a time lapse for 4 different time periods. The first being 1985, of course, then 1992, then 2004, then 2018. So again, if we focus in on the S22 area, you can see it gradually changed from low intensity development, especially going from the 1992 to 2004 period to medium intensity development just in that time period. And then from 2004 to 2018, a medium intensity to a lot more high intensity development. Now, the first habitat I'll be focusing on today are forests. Now, forests in the USVI are mostly subtropical dry and subtropical moist forests. On St. Thomas, the forest cover is about 43.6% per the USDA, and the forest acreage is 7,520 acres. Now, forests provide a variety of ecosystem services, some of them being that they sequester carbon by taking in the CO2 in the atmosphere and then incorporating it into their biomass from various processes. And this helps to mitigate the effects of climate change, which we help to contribute to by producing a lot of CO2 from our various daily activities. Forests also help to prevent soil erosion and sediment runoff by trapping soil in between their roots, in the roots of trees. They also are a major habitat for many terrestrial animals in the territory. So some of these terrestrial animals being bats, birds, insects, frogs, some reptiles, including the endangered VI tree boa that lives on the east end. So this is a map of the forest in St. Thomas, but also in relation to the major roads on the island, seen here in these yellow lines. And then the development intensities, again, including now the developed open space that's seen in the light green color. So you can see that a lot of the forests here on the northwest side of the island, that's where they exist, where it's more wet and hilly and there's less development there. And a lot of the forests that are here have been pretty fragmented, particularly in this northwestern corridor. You can see just where development has been occurring and going up from low intensity to medium intensity. Now, our continued development on the island has caused our forests to be fragmented, and forest fragmentation decreases the quality of our forests, which then decreases the quality of the ecosystem services that our forests provide for us. Now, one major habitat that's associated with forests are guts. Now, guts in the territory were historically used as a water source for domestic, agricultural, and industrial purposes. Guts also on the territory provide habitats and food for a variety of organisms, and guts that run through a lot of the urban areas that we have here on the territory sort of act as such as like a habitat corridor for some of these organisms that live in these highly disturbed areas. They also provide us with recreational opportunities such as hiking and nature walks. And guts historically influenced where we place buildings in the past, since they're one of the only fresh water sources on island, particularly in St. Thomas. And they also influence the placement of buildings now, since the VI code dictates that you can't build within a 30-foot radius from the center of a water course, and then also 25 feet from the edge of that water course. Guts in the territory also have been used for a lot of various research purposes and for science, and in particular, some even master's students at UVI here at St. Thomas have used guts as their focus areas. Now, this is a map showing the guts in St. Thomas depicted by these blue lines here. And of course, again, we're looking at the major roads with these yellow lines. The Waste Management Authority bin sites being these dark gray circles, the road gut intersections being these blue and white diamonds you see down in the Charlotte-Amalie area, and then the riverine flood zones that are associated with the guts that are depicted in dark gray. So immediately we can see there's a lot of road gut intersections down in the Charlotte and Mali area, and there's a lot of waste management bin sites that also are down in that area. So let's focus in. So now focusing more so on downtown Charlotte and Mali, you can see that all these waste management authority bin sites are really close to these guts and these road intersections that occur around them. So improperly disposed trash that may be around some of these bin sites, and also pollution from the roads that intersect with these guts, may get inside the guts and then decrease their habitat quality by introducing pollutants and extra sediment. And then also these guts can take these pollutants and sediment down to our marine ecosystems and negatively affect them as well. So moving closer to the coastline, we'll now look at wetlands as our next habitat. Wetlands in this instance being salt ponds, salt flats, freshwater ponds, and mangroves. Now, ecosystem service that mangroves provide is that they trap sediment and help to build up the shoreline by trapping sediment between their prop roots. Freshwater ponds and salt flats can also trap and filter runoff, which may contain pollutants and sediment that comes downhill before it enters our marine ecosystems. Mangroves also help to reduce the wave energy that's coming on shore and mitigates the impact of storm surge from storms. The trees and vegetation associated with these wetlands help sequester carbon and mitigate the effects of climate change. And mangroves have always been culturally and historically significant in the territory, and some of our freshwater ponds have been used by some small subsistence farmers in the past and even some today. Now this is a map of the wetlands in St. Thomas, wetlands being the cyan color here. So you can see some of the more noticeable wetlands may be those at the mangrove swamps at Megan's Bay up here. Those at the mangrove lagoon down there in the Steer area down here around Mavoni Cay. And then also Perseverance Bay over here. Now, our wetlands in the territory were negatively impacted by the 2017 hurricanes. And by using a slosh model, that is the sea, lake, and overland effects from storm surge from hurricanes model developed by the National Weather Service, we can see how storm surge from a hypothetical Category 4 hurricane could impact our wetlands on island. So, looking at a slosh model where the colors dictate that the blue is for up to 3 feet above ground for storm surge, yellow being greater than 3 feet above ground, orange being greater than 6 feet, and red being greater than 9 feet. If you look here at the left image for Megan's Bay and the swamps, we can see that Megan's Bay from a hypothetical Category 4 storm could experience up to greater than 3 feet above ground storm surge, which is pretty bad and could destroy some of these mangroves. Now, if we look here at the right to the mangrove lagoon area on St. Thomas again, we can see that the mangrove lagoon area from a hypothetical Category 4 storm could experience greater than 6 feet inundation in some of these areas. Now, if a hypothetical Category 4 storm could do this much damage to our mangroves, it's not surprising to see that 2 Category 5 storms has left our wetlands in very poor condition. Lastly, we'll now move into the marine system and talk about coral reef habitats. Now, coral reef habitats have always been very important in the USVI, and they provide significant economic value to us. Now, coral reefs support high biodiversity because a lot of fish use them as foraging areas and areas for spawning, and also nurseries for young fish as well. And this helps to prop up the fishing industry. And because there are areas where there's high biodiversity, they have always been aesthetically pleasing to look at, which brings in tourists that come to see our coral reefs, because then coral reefs only grow in the tropics and they're hard to see anywhere else. Coral reefs also help to provide coastal protection by buffering against the effects of wave action. That is, they help to break up the waves that are coming on shore before they can get to our beaches and erode them. They've always been historically and culturally important to the people of the US Virgin Islands over time, and they still provide recreational opportunities for us here on the territory with activities such as snorkeling and diving. So this map here on the left shows the coral cover in St. Thomas circa around 2017. And you can see here that there's a lot of coral on the north side of the island around here, and then some again on the east end, and then some further away in the more mesophotic region, past Water Island around here. Now, corals in the territory are affected by a lot of stressors, some anthropogenic and some natural. And one of the anthropogenic stressors that we contribute to is land runoff. So this map over here now shows exposure, St. Thomas exposure to land runoff in some of the coastal areas on island. Now, high land runoff values are seen in the orange values and orange and yellow values, and low being more in the blue side. So we can see here in downtown Charlotte-Amalie that there's high exposure to runoff, probably due to the fact that Charlotte-Amalie is mostly urbanized and there's a lot of impervious surfaces. So when rain or heavy rainfall comes, a lot of the sediment doesn't have anywhere else to go but off of these impervious surfaces and straight into the ocean. There's also some high land runoff just off the Peterborough Peninsula area up here. So if you can help to mitigate some of the runoff that we have coming off from island, we could also help to limit some of the impacts that we ourselves put on coral, and in addition to some stressors like thermal stress and also disease, which are big stressors for our coral reefs right now.
All right, thank you, Dijani. Who is our next speaker? Is it Chris? Or is it, it is Chris. All right, good. So Christopher McDonald, who is part of our hazard mitigation and resilience team, will be making a presentation with our colleagues.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher McDonald, and I'm from the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. Today, I'll be talking to you about agriculture ecosystem, and I'm glad that I was the last presenter because Dr. Ragster and Dijani really paved the way for this talk. When it comes to the agriculture system, our agriculture really supports the USVI economy. The photos below you see is from the farmers market here in town. We also have, when it comes to agriculture, food security, the discussion of how different crops is being grown. Also, when it comes to agriculture, soil quality. To give you an example of the different things that are grown in the USVI, you have vegetables such as cabbage, carrots, celery, cucumbers, eggplant, green beans. You also have field crops such as potatoes. And you also have fruit trees that you commonly see around the island, such as mangoes, avocado, bananas, coconuts especially. Also, when it comes, these photos below, these are from the St. Croix Farmers Market. Farmers Market, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it gives the option or opportunities for farmers to sell their goods. You see that not only that they sell their goods, but they have the opportunity to sell a variety of things, such as different seeds, such as hot sauce, and also plants if you do want to start your own garden as well. With agriculture, not only do they have crops, but they also have livestock. You have examples such as cattle, hogs, pigs, sheep, lambs, chickens, turkeys, ducks, geese, to just give you an example. And the photos that you see on screen is just an example of the livestock that we have in the US Virgin Islands, the intake that they have, and just how they are maintained, as well as how they are fed. When it comes to agriculture, this image is a map that really expressed the importance of prime farmland. And as Dr. Ragster said, over time, the development has definitely contributed to the decrease of prime farmland. And to give you an idea of what prime farmland is a term that is used to describe a combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food, feed, forage, fiber, and oilseed crops. In other words, it's known for the best areas for growing different resources. This map was created to represent the US Virgin Islands. You notice that specific areas such as St. Thomas, they have identified that different areas are known to have the best soil for producing crops. And compared to St. Croix, you see that there's numerous different locations best known for producing crops as well. But to give you an idea, I highlighted these few areas to direct your attention that they are very small, but they are known to have the best production of agricultural resources. And this is an enlarged photo of St. Thomas, since we're specifically talking about St. Thomas on this workshop. And in large, you see that there's, if you follow the arrows, there's areas in Bordeaux, there's areas in the north, south, east, and west of St. Thomas that you could highlight to identify that these were surveyed by the USDA to represent the best areas. But over time, we noticed that as development increased, the prime farmland decreased. So this map shows you an example of the areas that were developed. And when I mean developed, this means if you're familiar with the previous map that Dijani showed, areas with low, medium, and high intensity based on the 1985 classification, we compared it with the prime farmland. So we noticed that over time, the areas that you see in red is developed, and the areas that you see in a nice mustard yellow is undeveloped when it comes to prime farmland. And this is based on 1985. If you notice in 1992, some areas have shifted. And if you notice in St. John, you have the Cruz Bay, you have parts of Coral Bay. In St. Croix, you have the northern part of St. Croix, and you have bits of St. Croix that is completely developed, but majority of it is still undeveloped, in other words, prime farmland. And then you notice in St. Thomas, you see the similarities as well. As we move on over the years, we see in 2004, we noticed that development has definitely increased. And those areas that were prime farmland, especially in St. Thomas, we noticed that majority of St. Thomas prime farmland has been developed, and there's specific areas that are still undeveloped. Vice versa in St. John, we noticed that majority of the areas have been developed, especially in the Cruz Bay area and St. Croix as well. And then our last classification for our 2018, when it comes to prime farmland, we noticed that over time, St. Croix, well, we noticed that first for St. Thomas, over time that has been developed, and St. Croix, when it comes to 2018, we noticed that majority of the island has been developed as well. And this is all based on the prime farmland survey that was conducted by the United States Department of Ag. So in closing with this presentation, the agriculture system is reliant on ecosystem services, but it also provides food and maintenance. It also provides food as well as different research studies on the maintenance of soil. Agriculture not only is beneficial to the US economy, but it also provides different research opportunities, such as the previous maps that you've seen. There's a lot of research being conducted on the food safety, well, food security, as well as moving forward in the US Virgin Islands. And over time, based on the graphs that we've seen and based on Dr. Ragster's presentation, we noticed that the development is definitely increased in the US Virgin Islands, and it has been conducted on prime farmland soil. And with this information, definitely management decisions to preserve the remaining prime farmland soil is definitely needed to be for the US Virgin Islands. And also our last point is the soil survey, which was conducted, is used specifically for managing farming and local planning decisions. So that concludes the end of my talk. Thank you for listening. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to contact me.
All right. Thank you, Christopher. We are about 7 minutes over time, and so I've been trying to debate whether to give you a shorter break so that we can stay on schedule, but I suspect we also have a number of questions for our speakers. So let's take a few questions now, and if there's a lot more, perhaps we can spill over into post-break, but I do want to give people a chance to take a couple of minutes, bio break or what have you. So let's take 2 questions now. Let's see if there's, I'm scrolling up to the, well, let's find out if we have questions. Let's see. Please raise your hand or come on screen. Okay, so we have Miguel. Go ahead, Miguel.
Yeah, my question was about, I didn't see it yet, the value of increasing or restoring biodiversity as part as a strategy to build on resilience. I didn't see that on any of the slides, so I was just curious if that had been considered.
Well, I will say actually it's an area of focus for the VIF score project, where we're looking at the role of biodiversity in enhancing resilience. I think, you know, so there are folks here at the university looking at that specific question. I think the biodiversity, you know, land-based biodiversity, while a few folks know a great deal about it, it is not well articulated, and I don't know, you know, I think we still have more presentations that might pop up in some of the discussions yet to come, but it's certainly something that we are keeping in mind as we think about, you know, the value, whether it's the value or the perception of biodiversity or the function of biodiversity in mitigating hazards or adding robustness to our ecosystem. Other questions?
No, not a question, but Dr. Waddell, one of the things that I believe people who speak about biodiversity, assisting with supporting resilience, has to do more with the trade-offs that you're talking about.
Right.
And the challenge for the territory is that there are not a lot of trade-offs to do on both of them. Most of them are usually hard decisions. But that's the idea that if you maintain more options within your ecosystems, then the changes that you run into you will have an opportunity to come out more positive in the long run. We would need more research here for the territory, because the combination of invasives and a small space makes some of those questions hard.
Absolutely. All right. Any other questions? I'm seeing, let's zip through the chat room.
Hi, Kim. This is Hillary. I can't find my raise hand option, but
okay. Oh, so speak up. You're good to go.
I figured now is the moment. I just wanted to point out, so I'm Hillary Lohman. I'm the Coastal Resilience Coordinator with DPNR in the Division of Coastal Zone Management. Good morning, everybody, and thanks everyone for the presentations. I put it in the chat briefly, but I wanted to point out, as we went through the ridge to reef ecosystems, that wetlands, at least the mangrove, the actual shoreline bordering type of wetlands, the mangroves we have are of particularly critical ecosystem service to our fisheries for a lot of this similar but different reasons that were articulated around coral reefs. But there are like really critical life stages of finfish, commercial fish, and conch as well in seagrass and mangroves that we don't have many mangroves, as was pointed out on the maps. And so they're even more critical, because while coral reefs serve purposes, there are in fact there's a greater distribution of reefs or historical reef habitat than there is a distribution of mangroves and wetlands. And not only that, but they're also similarly heavily impacted by upland development and things that, again, were articulated in the reef part. But the wetlands, where they sit on the shoreline, will be catching that first. And so I just wanted to point that out. I think there's a particular critical urgency to pay attention to the mangroves, because they're very few and far between, and they're kind of irreplaceable for certain stages of certain fisheries that I believe everyone agrees are pretty important here now.
Oh, thanks, Hillary. And not to, I'm going to make one more plug for the EPSCoR program, our Ridge to Reef 5-year research capacity building grant from the National Science Foundation. We have both coral disease, coral recovery and restoration projects, but specifically the mangroves, we also have dedicated a fair number of resources to look at both the historical and the existing mangrove distribution and looking at ways to try and revive that and not just plant and hope for the best, but actually apply the best available science, looking for resistant, whether it's drought resistant or chemical resistance or disease resistance in these target species that we're trying to restore. So we are making an effort, but it's a lot of work and time is of the essence.
Yeah.
So any other, let me just quickly zip around here. I don't see any other hands. So let's take, okay, it's 10:43, 5 minutes, folks. We'll convene in 5 minutes at 10:48. So take a break and we'll see you shortly. Anyway, welcome everyone. We'd like to go ahead and resume let's try and stay on schedule. So now we're turning to our colleagues at the Harte Institute who will provide a couple of case studies and trade-off exercises looking at Magens Bay and Bordeaux. And so I'll turn it over to them at this point.
Good morning, everyone. Just turning my video on real quick to say hello, because I didn't introduce myself in my pre-recorded talk, which is what Michael's bringing up right now for us. But I am here in the chat box if you have any questions as we go through the next portion. Oh, and by the way, I'm with Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies as well. Thank you.
And just as a plug for our master's program, Hale was the first graduate of our Master's in Marine and Environmental Studies program many years ago, not too many, but many years ago. And so we're really proud to have her come back in her new position and exemplify the kind of great work that our alumni do on behalf of the territory. So thank you, Chris.
Okay.
But we're loading or something. Here we go.
Land use changes over time, as well as climate change impacts. Ecosystem services are changing too. Therefore, the well-being benefits that we receive from the Ridge to Reef ecosystem are changing as well. I'd like to dive in a little deeper on well-being and using examples relate mitigation activities to well-being and how we can navigate decision-making related to changing ecosystems. So, how should USVI communities deal with these changes? We know we can take preparedness measures like installing disaster warning systems, purchasing radio communications equipment, or participating in emergency response and recovery training. But preparedness is different from mitigation. Mitigation is the process of taking action to minimize and potentially eliminate the impact of hazards on communities, infrastructure, and natural resources. Now, there are many different hazard mitigation approaches that individuals and communities can take. And if you're like me, you can easily get lost down a rabbit hole when learning about all the mitigation options at our disposal. Thankfully, FEMA has made it easier on us by grouping mitigation actions into these 4 very general categories. I'd like to be clear that I am not a hazard mitigation expert. In fact, we may have some of those experts in our workshop today, but I point you to these examples of general actions that affect ecosystems. Given our theme for today's workshop, I especially want to focus on actions or management decisions concerning natural systems protection. This will help us understand the relationship between our actions concerning the environment and well-being outcomes in terms of resilience. In general, the term trade-off involves losing one quality or aspect of something in return for gaining another quality or aspect. In terms of ecosystem services, a trade-off is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly decreases the benefits supplied by another. A trade-off could occur in the same place or in a different place. For example, the impact of the management of an upland forest on local recreation, as well as on downstream water quality. There are also trade-offs between the present and future use of an ecosystem service. For example, overharvesting a fish stock now will have ramifications in the future. A synergy is a situation where the use of one ecosystem service directly increases the benefits supplied by another service. For example, the protection of coral reef areas impacts fish abundance, which in turn increases algal grazing and thus protects the coral, which eventually enhances recreation opportunities. So, given all of the potential trade-offs and synergies, how do we manage our natural resources so that we are maximizing the benefits that we receive? What are the trade-offs and where can we synergize? Well, one way we can consider our many options is by utilizing a framework such as ecosystem service logic models. These models represent the way a management action cascades through an ecological system and results in ecosystem services and human well-being impacts. Logic models are a great tool to compare strategies across locations to match likely outcomes with stakeholder goals. Additionally, evidence that accompanies these models can be used to clarify uncertainties that need to be considered and to identify critical research gaps. If standardized, these models can provide a consistent platform for multiple hazard mitigation approaches and help increase monitoring efficiency. We are presenting this framework to you today as one of many decision-making approaches, and although the logic model development can get quite complex rather quickly, you'll see this in a later slide, I use it to simply demonstrate the many well-being outcomes, or more specifically, the socioeconomic outcomes that can result when a community places the local ecosystem at the heart of the decision-making process. So let's start by talking about these outcomes. Through research and application, we know that some outcomes of restoration are associated with resilience. And I'm talking about restoration because it's one example of a hazard mitigation practice. For example, increased economic activity in a particular community through jobs, labor, and income allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks that harm the economy. So this is one example of a socioeconomic outcome linked to resilience. Additionally, when people in the community are employed, they enjoy greater levels of economic resilience and are able to respond better to unexpected shocks. Also, diverse job markets are known to be more resilient because the community does not depend on just one industry. In terms of costs and expenditures, damage to property is a direct reflection of structural resilience, and repair costs for property damage similarly link to the property owner's economic resilience. Increased spending at businesses in a particular community allow that community to be more resilient to external shocks. If spending takes place at businesses outside of the target community, then this may not affect local resilience. The ability for shoreline property to withstand external stressors like flooding and erosion represents a facet of structural resilience. Increases in property value can be linked to an individual household's economic resilience, and at a larger scale, increases in a community's property values, which can lead to a larger tax base, can be linked to economic resilience at the community level. Additionally, community members' health and associated capabilities are essential to resilience. A healthy community is better able to respond to and cope with external shocks. When community members gain increased knowledge and understanding of their environment in the context of threats to resilience, this can help spur increased public support for future similar restoration projects that would add to resilience. Strengthened or maintained cultural values can be linked to community ties and increased social capital, which in turn lead to increased social resilience. Critical facilities, for example, hospitals, schools, and government buildings, are important for a community's ability to respond to hazardous events. Therefore, changes in their closure rate impact a community's resilience. So again, each of these specific outcomes that I just reviewed result from making change to an ecosystem, such as restoration, that are associated with resilience. I'm going to show you on our next slide where some of these outcomes relate to hazard mitigation using a logic model. So here is one example of a fully developed ecosystem service logic model that my team developed with partners for a previous project. I know it looks like a tangled and chaotic mess, and don't worry too much about what each of those boxes says right now. I simply want to point out the main ideas here. We'll break it down into a simpler, more digestible logic chain using some local examples in just a minute. So what are we looking at here? This model shows a management action or an intervention, and here's the key if you want to follow along. So on the left is the management action or intervention. In this case, the action is mangrove restoration, which is one example of a natural systems approach to hazard mitigation. The arrows connect that action to the many effects it has on different components of the ecological system, seen here as gray boxes or intermediate components. These are then connected by additional lines to the human activity outcomes of that action, seen as light blue boxes. Those human activities then result in socioeconomic outcomes, the yellow boxes on the right side of this model. It's important to note that these ecosystem service logic models have been validated by peer-reviewed science as well as experts in the respective fields. The lines show key pathways. And as you can see here in the key, the dark yellow represents strongly linked socioeconomic outcomes, whereas the faded out yellow are weakly linked socioeconomic outcomes. So I'm going to pull a few threads from this crazy mess of a model to help set us up for our discussion. Here is our first example, Megan's Bay. I know most of you are very familiar with Megan's Bay, so I won't spend too much time describing this ecologically and economically important location. But for those of you who may not be familiar, some history. In 1946, Arthur S. Fairchild gifted Megan's Beach and some adjoining land to the people of the U.S. Virgin Islands. The area is now managed by the Megan's Bay Authority for public recreation, and in following the donor's wishes that the area be maintained as a public park with its natural beauty preserved for use by the people of the Virgin Islands in perpetuity without discrimination of any kind as to race, creed, color, or national origin. This beach is iconic. National Geographic dubbed it as one of the top 10 most beautiful beaches in the world. The 1.5-mile nature trail starts at the top of the mountain and leads down to the beach, winding through multiple habitats like mixed dry forests, moist tropical forests, and across a boardwalk that passes through mangroves and then finally on the white sandy beach. There are also 2 guts that drain into the Magens Bay watershed. I've pulled a lot of these little informational tidbits from the Magens Bay Authority's website. Hopefully it's been updated, so apologies if some of these acreages aren't current. I'm not sure how that's changed since 2017 storms, but in general, this is a beach that's used not only by tourists, but by locals as well as a place to enjoy life. There's educational programs that are offered here, camps, church groups. A lot of activities take place at Magens Bay. So, as we all know, mangroves, sea grapes, and the many other trees and plants, both native and non-native in Magens Bay, were denuded and or uprooted from hurricanes in 2017, in addition to impacts to other habitats in Magens and the wildlife that lives in or utilizes this area. But for now, let's focus on Magens Bay mangroves. Remember, this is just an example, and I'm sure restoration efforts have already taken place here and are already revealing benefits to the community and ecosystem. But for the sake of learning through today's workshop, let's pretend we're at the point in time where we are just planning projects that have the potential to mitigate hazards in the long term. So, as Dijani pointed out earlier, healthy mangroves provide a multitude of ecosystem services, and restoring them can be a powerful choice for hazard mitigation. But is this the best option? Should resource managers invest in mangrove restoration? What outcomes can islanders expect from mangrove restoration efforts? Let's start with our example, management action, creating new or restoring existing mangrove forest. So, what changes happen that result in resilience-related outcomes? My community is specifically interested in economic activity and human health outcomes. Obviously, because Magens Bay is extremely important to the tourism industry, but also because, as I noted, it's important to human health through all the exercising, socializing, lining, and unwinding that people cherish this area for. So when we restore the mangroves, perhaps through planting seedlings with the help of community volunteers, we can expect that those seedlings will grow and increase in quantity and quality over time. Once those mangroves are mature enough, we also know that they will filter water that flows down the hillsides and through their prop roots, and they also capture sediment that travels from upland areas. Thus, water quality is improved. Because the water quality is improved, recreational activities rebound. People want to come view not only the mangroves themselves, but the wildlife that resides among the Magens Bay mangroves and other adjacent habitats. Visitors will also resume paddleboarding, swimming, and other activities in the Magens Bay area as a result of improved mangrove habitat and water quality. Finally, we can see that with proliferation of human activity in the Magens Bay area, economic activity picks back up. Additionally, people are interacting with nature in such a way that their health is impacted. And as I mentioned earlier, both of these outcomes are associated with resilience. So what does this mean? In a very simplistic way, this one logic chain, which is validated by evidence in the academic literature, can help guide thought process in terms of choosing actions that might result in desirable resilience outcomes. Project managers, practitioners, and community leaders can make decisions about which ecosystem service they may or may not want to invest in when it comes to choosing mitigation activities related to natural systems protection. Here is another simple logic chain, but this one results in property protection. Following along from the management action of restoring mangroves, we can see that once established, mangroves provide the services of wave attenuation and erosion control, which results in property protection. Property protection, of course, is a desirable outcome in the Magens Bay area, not only for the managers of Magens Bay, who need to make decisions about maintaining the land for continued use, but potentially it's important to private landowners in the surrounding area that are interested in benefiting from the protection that the natural structure of mangroves provides. Again, those two logic chains are only a few threads of a much more complex system. But using these ecosystem service logic models as a decision framework, synergies can be identified or trade-offs considered. Our second example is focused on farms and the farming community of Bordeaux. Even though farms aren't technically a habitat, there are certainly many activities related to this type of land use that can affect resilience. I also wanted to show this as an example where using logic models can highlight knowledge gaps. Let's take a look. So, we know that drought is a serious issue across the entire territory and continues to pose challenges to the farming community. However, there are drought management techniques that island farmers can consider employing that will benefit not only them, but the wider community. For example, planting drought-resistant crops. So that's our management action we have identified in the blue box here. So if we are successful in planting these drought-resistant crops, then we can expect that yield will improve, as will quality, so crop production in general. And of course, it's not hard to figure out that yield will be brought to market, which will result in economic activity outcomes. Additionally, with the sale of locally produced foods, human health outcomes will result, particularly that of food security for communities, which is of particular importance for the Bordeaux community. Now, this is obviously a very basic logic chain just to demonstrate the linkages between land use and outcomes, but it raises questions such as, what kind of crops are drought resistant? Are they native fruits and vegetables, or are they introduced species? If we plant crops that aren't native to St. Thomas, is there a risk of spreading more invasive species? And if so, are the human health and economic benefits worth that risk? These are just some of the trade-offs that must be considered and potentially where more research is needed to fully vet the various decisions and potential pathways to a more resilient island community. So, I've walked through these example logic models using locally relevant locations, Megan's Bay and Bordeaux. And although it was a quick review, I hope it set you up for thinking about what's important to you as an individual and what's important to your community, because we are going to have a group discussion. So I'm going to pause here and get set up for that.
All right, well, thank you, Chris and everyone else. I think this was a good sort of technical introduction to, you know, how we deal with those trade-offs, you know, whether it's economic benefit, quality of life, or environmental condition and function. These are some of the challenges that we face. And so let's open it up to questions, including questions that might have carried over from before the break, if there's any lingering there, but I'd like to make sure that we can answer any questions before we go into the discussion exercise. Raise your hand or put something in the chat room. Okay, I don't know who that is, but speak up.
Laverne.
Oh, sorry,
Hi, no problem. My question is a general one for you and for the folks in Texas regarding addressing hazard mitigation as part of a continuum of changes happening in an environment. Right now, the territory is in recovery. We're in another hurricane season. So if you decide to, initiate a particular type of mitigation earlier this year, do you keep restarting the clock? How are you thinking that through in terms of, one, how you present it to people and decision makers about the value of doing it in a set of conditions that actually continue to change?
Oh, no, it's a good question, and it's a challenge because, you know, both David Yaskowitz and all of us have acknowledged that we are in a rapidly changing environment. And with the seasonality that is posed by hurricanes and other disruptions, it is hard to sort of map out strategies. I mean, ultimately, what we are hoping to do is sort of look beyond just the superficial fixes and look at the underlying conditions that are here regardless of season or time, because the reality is that the territory has faced a lot of disruptions, economic, pandemic, as well as natural, over the past 15, 20 years, if not longer. But I think by focusing on the strengthening the systems and their operations, you know, how we manage our resources in this particular instance, you know, are there things that we can do for the farmers in Bordeaux or for the management of Megan's that, you know, prepare us for the setbacks that we know will come, whether it's a storm or an economic downturn. You know, what can we do to sort of set the stage that we can recover more quickly and or take less time and less resources to recover? Because I think that's one of the big things that we're looking at now is that, you know, we're almost 4 years past the 2017 storms and we're still in this recovery mode. Well, the reality is that the recovery of, you know, for a disaster of that magnitude, and we saw it with Hurricane Sandy, we see it with Katrina and New Orleans, they sometimes take over a decade or longer. And so we have to manage our expectations, work at the fundamental challenges, and see if we can make improvements to the systems, the people, the communities that are involved in managing these resources in such a way that these hopefully temporary setbacks don't force us to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch. But I turn to the folks in Texas or Greg or anyone else to weigh in.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Dave.
Dr. Ragster, yeah, when you asked that question, I was thinking about kind of changing baselines, right? And Kim, you and I had a lot of experience addressing that question after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And so, you know, two very prominent events that we're still recovering from now are Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and also here more directly in Texas is Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And what we're finding in terms of the planning around restoration and conservation activity is to be thinking about that, what that baseline is going to look like, you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out, and plan for conservation and restoration through that lens, and not try to really get back where we are today or where we were 10 years ago. And the big driver here is sea level rise, right? So we want to plan our efforts and use those scarce resources widely, thinking 30, 40, 50 years out at least. And I don't know if that's addressing your question, maybe in part.
No, I think it does. Greg, if you could control the echo, we go.
Yeah, no, just very quickly, I just wanted to add to what Dave and you have said by saying that, you know, one thing, Dr. Ragster, that was very interesting in your presentation was your constant referring of standards. And I think, you know, as part of this discussion, you know, and I think Kim alluded to in his answers, we can do things. We can say, oh, we're going to restore this mangrove, that mangrove, this thing. And that has a special timeline and threats and all that stuff, and people saying, did you do it or not? But at the same time, we can also start talking about standard and values that will guide the discussion and guide the effort, and that have a long-term time scale and can help go through different type of failures and difficulties that will arise. So with the mitigation activity, the thinking, and with this ecosystem service discussion, the thinking is not thinking about let's build a coral reef to protect Christiansted before the next hurricane arrives, but more the type of discussion that Chris sort of alluded to, of really looking at more comprehensively what's going on, more comprehensively what those ecosystems provide for us, both from a hazard mitigation and a quality of life, which is as you mentioned, Dr. Ragster, as important to hazard mitigation as having a seawall, and really thinking through, okay, what are we going to do with this framework? So just wanted to add that.
No, that helps. Thank you. I was just thinking that the whole issue of uncertainty that I spoke about before, and you spoke about constant change, when we speak to people about we're presenting a hazard mitigation plan, the way we speak about it needs to make sure it addresses those concerns. Okay, so to me, the way you deal with that to some extent is to go to the endpoint that you talk about in terms of the services that you want to maintain. And that despite the fact that we know things may continue to change and that there will need to be adjustments, these are the kinds of actions that you have to put in place to get here or to stay here in that way. Again, I'm concerned, I'm hearing the language, and it worries me that when you present that way to many people in this community, I believe they will see it as a plan for the shelf, because it doesn't allow you to think about the context that people aren't admitting to. It's just a thought. So I just thought I would, your question about how you dealt with it made me think of that, and perhaps that's something that you might want to consider.
No, point taken, thank you. Looks like we have a survey. Chris or someone else, you want to introduce?
Yes. Yes. Sorry, guys. I can only see what I'm sharing right now on my screen, so I can't see your faces. But if you want to chat questions or anything like that, we've got Kara in the chat box. But basically, Dr. Ragster, you're right on point with where we're moving in this conversation. We really want to get at what the community themselves, individuals and community-wide, what they value and what outcomes they want. And obviously, there's different subgroups of communities, different interests overlapping, which causes challenge, but also opportunity. And so this is a real basic, really just meant to engage you all, but a basic survey. And please bear with me, this is my first time using mentimeter.com. So we're gonna do this virtually and talking about risks. We're asking you all to go to menti.com. You can see that up here at the top of the screen, menti.com, and use the code that's also there. And I think Kara's gonna put it in the chat box if it's easier for folks to access it that way. And really just follow along with that question. So this is our first question, and what I'm asking you all to do is to rank the human well-being outcomes that you think decision makers should prioritize for your island community. And so we've only have those 8 that I reviewed earlier, and again, these are just grouped by those that we know through peer-reviewed literature and has been applied in many different types of restoration and resilience-related projects as being outcomes for resilience. So please go ahead and make your selections using menti.com, and we should be seeing some results popping up here shortly. Interesting. Here we go. We're going to give people a little bit more time to figure out menti.com. But it looks like property protection is coming in. Oh, human health. Okay. Yeah. Gonna wait a little bit longer. It's not an easy choice to make. I think people are probably changing their responses and rearranging as they consider those trade-offs. All right, we've got about 15 votes, 16 votes so far. And I, you know, listening to some of the questions and comments and discussions so far this morning, you know, I've already heard a couple opinions about, you know, what people are valuing. You know, the mangroves versus the corals is a big one, but what outcomes that those can actually result in. We've got 17 responses. Human health remains at the top of the list.
There's 36 people on, so there's no peer pressure here, but
Right, and I encourage those of us on the team here who are Virgin Islanders as well. Even though you're part of this project team, you know, your vote counts too. You're part of this community. Ah, 18. I'll wait one more minute. I think I can hear someone's wind chimes in the background. It sounds lovely.
It's probably mine.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. Good ears.
Good headset, I think. All right, we got 20 responses. I'm gonna, for the sake of time, move on to our next question, but real quick, it looks like, of course, human health is at the top. Coming in second place is cultural and heritage values, property protection at third. It's interesting, property value is at the bottom. And when I was creating this presentation and these polls, I was curious if property value would really resonate with folks here. And again, that has a little bit to do with the tax base. And I wonder, you know, if anyone's willing to offer up an explanation for how they voted. If any of you voted for property value as the bottom of the list, maybe you could take yourself off mute and offer, you know, a thought as to why that might be the case.
I can offer a suggestion. You do realize that land is limited. We are short approximately 5,000 housing units in the territory. They change all the time. And most people who feel they're long-term residents here have not been able to afford a home. So that question this is probably not that group to ask.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Hey, I'll speak up on my voting there. I put property protection as number one and property value as 8 because I feel like in conversations like this, I try to go extremely to my environmental side in order to really tease out those benefits and those issues. So while property value is really important in an economic setting, or as Dr. Ragster said, you know, home purchasing and our difficulties and sometimes inability to purchase property as local Virgin Islanders, that is a huge issue. But for today, what we're looking at, I chose to really hone in on the environmental protection aspects of that.
Nice. Thank you, Kitty, for that explanation. And I think both Dr. Ragster's and Kitty's comments emphasize the need to make these plans extremely local, right? Obviously, we can't take what's useful perhaps on the state side and the continental state side and bring it here to the islands, expect it to work. We really need to get the feedback of the folks who experience these situations and get them involved in planning going forward. And of course, this is just a simple survey, but perhaps reproducing something similarly and more comprehensive for the entire St. Thomian population in some cases might be, you know, one avenue to explore for getting additional feedback. We're going to move on to the next question. Hopefully. All right. So what habitat do you value as most important for hazard mitigation and resilience? And so this is an open-ended structured question, so just go ahead and type your answer.
We had 22 last time. Let's 24. All right.
Is Mentimeter free?
There is a free version, yes, but you're very limited into how many questions you can ask with the free version.
Okay.
We went in for a paid version so we could get more accessibility to the software, but it is a fun way to interact. So it looks like we've got a lot of ideas here for different habitats, and someone commented too that's a really tough choice to make, and I think, yeah, and this gets back to some of the conversations we were having earlier with I think there was a biodiversity question Dr. Ragster asked. You know, when we make these decisions and think about our different options, we really have to consider the full suite of habitats and full suite of outcomes and their interactions when it comes to not only mitigation projects specifically, but planning in general. And so it's really hard to narrow it down to just one habitat. But it helps us at least steer in the direction towards what our community is interested in at least trying, and then perhaps adapting as we go forward, as we see where we're succeeding or maybe need more effort.
Great, Chris, I think that's a really critical point. And I would go back to, you know, what we're calling this, right? We're calling this ecosystem services, and we're not calling it habitat services. But,
Right.
you know, over the years and by default, I think just to maybe compartmentalize and make it easier for analysis, we have defaulted to just looking at a very specific habitat or a very specific species. But I think if you're looking at resilience, it's critical to look at the system, right? I mean, what I like to say is we should be putting system back into ecosystem services. Because while one part of a system might be degraded, it is potentially another part of that system can step up and provide some similar benefits, at least temporarily. So I think that's a critical point.
Thank you, David. Did anyone else want to offer any comments here at this point?
I would just jump in a little bit. Again, the points are well taken so far. I think when we think about mitigation strategies, one of the other challenges is the resources that we have to actually implement them. And so, you know, we have to look at where do we get the best return on our investment, which is limited by circumstance or by choice. And the idea is, you know, for example, if we protected the guts and the upland forests, you know, I mean, that's not necessarily critical habitat, but if we did that, whether it's through a land use plan or something else, we might have cascading much better consequences further down the hillside, and you may not need to worry about the mangroves and you know, the seagrass beds, for example, if you manage the upland resources a bit better. And that is hopefully it's not a trade-off, but recognize that some investments, critical strategic investments, may actually have a long tail of cascading benefits down, you know, literally and figuratively downstream.
And you could have more control, because
Right.
I like your point, Dr. Waddell, because the idea that if you stop people from building drains that empty onto roads that go straight down the mountain, you would have less runoff in a number of places. So that's a control that can happen on our side.
Right.
All right, let's move on to our, oh, is there a question in the chat box? Oh, we have a question. Shouldn't this question be tied to the hazard and then prioritize the most critical hazards to mitigate against? Well, you're kind of beating me to the punch there. Yes, we're certainly going to tie that into the mitigation and the hazard and also the outcome. So all of these will be tied together. And for full transparency or full disclosure, we're trying to collect a little bit of this feedback from you all, because in our project team's final report, we're going to be pointing to this as an example for methodology for moving forward. So just like, and I think it's Robbie, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Robbie, I think, this is really what we need to do, is tie these all together, but make it locally relevant. It can't be an external partner creating these logic models or creating these plans for you all. We want to hear from you where you value these efforts, and then we can, work together to create these plans, and then maybe even come up with a monitoring plan so that we can adapt going forward. But that's a great segue into my third question. If you had to pick one, which type of mitigation activity do you feel would benefit your island community the most?
Yeah, Chris, this is Craig. One question I have is the time scale. When we think about hazard mitigation and habitat, we tend to think about, oh, the coral reef is going to protect against the storm, or the mangrove is going to reduce the wave, stuff like that. But I think there is a different, longer time scale at which, the ecosystems provide the service to sort of help things regenerate, help things sort of strengthen their sort of ability to resist the shock, help provide the water and stuff like that. That is not the hazard scale. Just gonna want to point that out to make sure that, we're not just talking about event scale.
Right, and I'd also add in too the time it takes sometimes for our management entities to get to work, right? So that is not always in step with what's going on in reality either. So you've got, our ecosystems responding differently at different time scales, and the people responding and recovering at different time scales as well. And so that's something to take into consideration when we're making decisions.
And Greg, I would also add, especially if you're, using a nature-based approach, is that especially if you're doing restoration, there's that restoration effort is going to mature over time, right? So what you put in the ground or in the water today, if done properly, should only enhance ecosystem services, enhance potential resiliency because of the maturity of the habitat itself and its connection to the system. Whereas if you use gray infrastructure, engineered infrastructure, after it's put in, technically it starts to degrade right away, right? There is no maturity in that. It's matured the day it's put in, and there's only one way for it to go.
If I may, one of the things that has occurred to me is that when I think about hazards for the territory, the ones that have been popping up in my mind more often these days have to do with long-term assaults from climate changes, okay? So the two that I'm most concerned about are increased temperatures and the change in the precipitation pattern. And those two are ones that I see great payoffs with respect to hazard mitigation, because they're going to continue for a long time, and they're ones that other people can't, I mean, somebody can't come with a plane and help you. You have to fix the thing on your side. So what does the territory do under those kind of conditions? And if we are, I don't think there are a lot of people in the territory that are foolish enough to think that the solution is going to be WAPA making water, because it's not able to make current most of the time. So it's going to be a challenge in terms of the future with how we deal with not having enough water for the territory.
Thank you, Dr. Ragster. Perhaps I should have added a question here about what issue or threat concerns you the most, but next time. For the sake of time, I'm going to move us on to the next portion of our discussion. I'm going to hand the mic over to Dijani Laplace, and we're going to walk through additional questions with him.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So now we'll just move into our community engagement discussion, and I'll just be asking a few questions. So I'll just be asking a few questions about how individuals in our community get involved with some of the entities in the territory and how they communicate and what they get the information from. So for our first question, what obstacles keep individuals or communities from being involved in decisions that affect ecosystems? Now you can answer this with 3 words or a few phrases. I like those first 3 words: awareness, positivity, and hardship. You have responses from 4 people so far, now 5. It's getting a variety of responses now. From a lot of these responses so far, it seems that we've been having a lot of difficulty, or people felt that has been difficult for them to get involved in a lot of these decisions from a variety of these responses so far. Before we go on a little bit more, a lot of these responses are pretty passionate. Does anybody want to explain any of their responses so far? I'll give an example of some of the situations that might have led them to feel this way.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak up again. You guys know that I'll never shy away from my microphone. So I'm noticing a lot that are very similar to some of the words that I put in, hardship and poverty. These are issues that I have come up against a lot in my outreach programs where it's really hard to find a way to have discussions with people, you know, regarding 30, 40 years in the future when they're having trouble with dinner tonight. And that is something that we need to look at a lot, and how we address issues and how we talk about them and how we educate the community about them. Another one that I'm seeing, and I kind of try to look at issues from different standpoints within the community. And so I was looking at those of us who are very passionate about these issues. It can be hard to maintain your positivity. And I see, oh goodness, they're moving so much that I can't find the exact words, but you know, we roller coaster, we plummet in passion and positivity. And there are times when even those of us who are working really hard on issues just can't finish the day and keep on working on these issues just because it seems helpless sometimes, helpless and hopeless. And so that is something that is, you know, we are aware of. And then finally, you know, lack of information, lack of education, lack of outreach, lack of reach within those of us who are doing outreach. These are all issues that we face. So those are a few of my thoughts on the topic.
And I
I
agree
would
with
just
a lot.
add real quickly, I completely agree with your assessment. The one thing I would add, I put lack of information, but that's incorrect. That's actually incomplete, because it isn't the information that they don't have sometimes. It's how the information is presented. So it's lack of information in a understandable or usable way. That's what I should put. It isn't just the information. You can have a conversation with somebody about why are you calling something a one type of crab when they know it as another type of crab. So how you say it matters.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ragster, and thank you, Kitty Edwards, for those remarks. I think a lot of the problems that stem from this type of question is just a problem with ourselves and human nature, very short-sighted, and that also extends to a lot of decisions that we make in our daily lives. Let's move on to the next question. So how can people get more involved in decisions concerning the USVI ecosystem and their well-being? Again, if you could answer with 3 words or phrases.
Hi, this is Hillary. I figured this would be a good minute or two to weigh in on the bridge between the last question and this, because people are still voting. So, and I put it in the chat, but I think also, again, I do work for DPNR. I'm on the management side of these things. And I think I'll speak for myself when I say it's something I am aware of and I'm trying to work on. And it's hard because it was also mentioned, we're all really doing our best, choosing to spread ourselves thin in order to cover as much as we can in these jobs that we're all here because we're passionate about, personally as well as professionally. But I think there's also something unintentionally, but with consequence, inconsistent about how we share information about projects we're working on, about their implications, about things that have happened, and then, and the consistency with which we update things. And maybe we throw out a flyer after a project and then we move on to the next project. I think if we were more consistent and systematic and strategic about how we describe the work we're doing, and then how and when and why people are invited to weigh in, and how and when and why they're invited to weigh in. I think there's just a lot of inconsistency in that, and I can see it from both sides of the table. I miss out, I'm positioned to hear and see a lot of things going on, and I miss hearing and seeing of things going on still. And I'm like, wow, if that happens to me, you know, how could anyone who's not spending their 9 to 5 doing this not miss that? I don't have a solution there, but I do think, again, just something to keep in mind at that real scaled out thing is like how making sure we're mindful of doing our best to be consistent in what we're saying, and what is the role of asking versus not asking, I guess.
No, thank you, Hillary. Those are good comments and problems that we have now in our society. Right now, the access to information is pretty high. There's information all over, but just us actually getting access to it has been low. We have a lot of things going on in our daily lives, and it can be pretty difficult to navigate some of these websites and then news media outlets and other social media apps to just get information. So if you're not doing it every day, again, I can see why some people may have problems accessing the information, even though it's all over.
So I think something that Hillary said that I think is really important, and actually goes back to watching the words change. On the last one, one of the phrases that popped up was lack of engagement from the government. And I think that sometimes as government employees, we're afraid to speak up as a government employee. And as Hillary so wonderfully introduces herself every time as a DPNR employee. Hi, I'm Kitty Edwards, and I am the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Coastal Zone Management Division of DPNR. And sometimes we kind of hide behind our pictures and don't speak up as government representatives because it can be scary and people can be really mean to us sometimes, but we keep going. So I think that there's a balance between sharing information about our projects, and I do agree, you know, I know a lot of the work that Hillary's doing and projects that we have that we're trying to push through just within CZM, and if we don't share enough about that to the public, how are they supposed to know? And I know that as an outreach coordinator, maybe that should be more blame put on me. Sorry, guys. We're working on a lot of really cool stuff. And in relation to this next question about how people can get more involved, I feel like a lot of people take more time criticizing than trying to get involved. So rather than saying, how come this isn't happening, say, how can this happen? Because it's possible that somebody is trying and keeps on getting pushed down. So not to get too into it, but just wanted to get that out there.
Again, thank you, Kitty, again, for mentioning that. And I do think it's very important to bridge the gap between getting information from a DPNR or government or even some science representative or researcher, and then getting it to the average person who works maybe a 9 to 5 or works in some other government entity, so that they can connect and understand what's going on and what's going on around the island.
Yeah,
so see, we have a lot of responses. I'm sorry, Kim, go ahead.
No, I want to go back to what Dr. Ragster pointed out, just about it isn't just the lack of information. You know, I answered this question about, you know, how do we get people involved? And I put in, you got to go to them, you know, you got to meet them in where they're comfortable. You know, you have to listen, you know, I mean, I think the dynamic between whether it's scientists or experts or, you know, people with formal education or whatever, and they're talking to an audience who may not have some of those, you know, attributes, and yet are quite worldly in other ways. We have to find a way to communicate in a way that treats them as equals, listens to them, and you know, and then perhaps we're asking the wrong questions, or we're addressing the wrong issue from their point of view. And I think that exchange, that dialogue is absolutely essential. And the last thing I said is, you know, we got to do more with the young people, the children in particular, because they are the ones, they have open minds, they have a natural curiosity, and they are our future. And so I often find that they are sometimes the most receptive. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember being a child and being exposed to litter campaigns and anti-smoking campaigns. And you know, you take it home and you share it with your parents. And, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways we can get this information out, but I think we often default to the come to us and we'll tell you what's going on. And that's, you're already making a few mistakes right there.
Mhm.
And I agree. I see we have 16 responses, but for the interest of time, we'll move on to the next question. So are there any success stories concerning local ecosystems where community engagement resulted in positive change? Please type your response. So now is just the time, but we heard a lot of the negative responses or difficulties that people have been having with communication between the two entities, the public and then the government and more research-oriented persons. Now will be a good time for you guys to just say any positive things that you've experienced so far.
Okay.
I see some responses trickling in, cascade, steer, awareness of coral ecosystems. So I'm assuming that's an article or a paper. And a development of a management plan for Cascade again, involving students in the 1980s. So in the 60s, it seems like the Northside community stopped condos from being built on Whole Point. It's a good example of the community coming together and stopping what they might have deemed to be a negative development. So we've been at 6 for a while. We'd hope that we would get a little bit more to trickle in. So stony coral tissue loss disease awareness came up again. The St. Croix Environmental Association purchasing land for conservation easement at Chinee Bay at St. Croix. And then stopping hotel development near private at the time portion of Megan Bay. Now we're just gonna wait for a few more responses to come in. from Mandel Bay Development. Okay. So I thank you everybody for their responses so far, and this has been very helpful.
All right, well, we're winding down. We have just a few minutes left. I don't know if my colleagues from Texas A&M or the HMRP team want to say anything, but on behalf of everyone organizing this workshop, I want to first thank all of you for participating, taking time out of your busy lives. I particularly want to acknowledge contributions of Dr. Laverne Ragster. I think she's sparked great conversation and questions in the beginning, and her contributions throughout the day have really helped us and our colleagues from Texas A&M. I think a number of you, asked questions about what UVI is doing, or specifically around biodiversity, and I want to make a third plug for the VI EPSCoR annual conference on July 15th and 16th. The website and link to registration is there in the chat, but if you just go to VI EPSCoR.org, I believe. I just went blank, that's embarrassing. But anyway, check us out. There it is in our Kelly Harrigan Save My Butt once again. Click on the link and register, and you can learn about what we're doing here at the university around biodiversity, around that ridge to reef, the contributions and impacts all up and down our ecosystems, and how they cascade into our marine and coastal ecosystems, including the effects of land use practices around agriculture. And so this is one of the first times that the EPSCoR program is really, focused on ag practices and land use practices for impacts in the coastal and marine systems. Anyway, enough plug there. Thank you all for your time. This was, I think, a great start to a week of, we're going to be talking with our colleagues in St. John tomorrow, and then on Friday in St. Croix. So obviously chime in and or join in and listen to those conversations. And I think David Yaskowitz would like to say a few words as well.
No, I was just clapping. That's the clapping.
Oh. Misreading the hand signal, sorry. So anyway, thanks everyone. Stay safe, and if you have time, join us tomorrow and on Friday.